pleasure to be back in Korea and a pleasure to be back in Seoul. Last time I was here it was winter and very cold, and now it is summer and too hot. I think everybody who is a language learner has experienced written corrective feedback. You've all done pieces of writing and handed them in and then got them back with lots of red marks on them correcting your errors, etc. I'm sure you've all experienced that. Am I right? Right. The big question is, does it help? In particular, does it help you to avoid making the same errors in the future? And I think this is not just a question that language learners should be interested in. It's a question that language teachers should be interested in. Because if it doesn't particularly help, then it seems to me that teachers are wasting their time putting these red marks on your paper, etc. So what I want to do is to look at different types of written corrective feedback and also refer you to some of the research that has investigated written corrective feedback. I want to begin with a statement of the problem. And I got a quote here from Highland and Highland, man and wife, about this particular problem. They say, while feedback is a central aspect of L2 writing programs across the world, the research literature has not been equivocally positive about its role in L2 development. And teachers often have a sense that they are not making full use of its potential. In order to talk sensibly about written corrective feedback, we need to identify two different purposes for why teachers might correct students' written work. The first purpose is to enable students to revise their own writing. In other words, the purpose of correction is not necessarily to help you avoid future errors, but simply to enable you to produce a better second draft, to revise your first piece of writing. So one question that we could immediately ask is, does written corrective feedback help students to actually revise their written work? And the second purpose of correcting students' written work is, of course, to help them to acquire correct English. By correcting errors, we hope that learners will observe the corrections and then avoid making future errors. If we're going to talk about written corrective feedback, we need to identify that feedback can focus on different areas. It can focus, for example, on the content of what you write. It can point out that you have omitted certain key references or certain key points, that your informational content can be improved. The feedback could focus on organization, such as paragraph structure or the actual paragraphing of your writing. And thirdly, it can focus on language. It can focus on actual corrective feedback. In this talk, I'm only going to address the third of these purposes, of these foci. I'm only going to be talking about how written corrective feedback can address language. I'm going to present to you a typology of corrective feedback types. In other words, I'm going to identify different ways in which teachers can correct learners' linguistic errors. Now, this typology has two dimensions to it. The first dimension is to look at the different strategies for providing corrective feedback. And the second dimension is to address how teachers should encourage students to respond to the feedback. So there's these two dimensions. How do you do the correction? How do you get students to examine the corrections and use the corrections to improve their acquisition? First of all then, let's look at corrective feedback strategies. These are the strategies that I'm going to discuss. These are labels for them. These are all different types of strategies that have actually been researched by writing researchers. direct corrective feedback, indirect corrective feedback, metalinguistic corrective feedback. There's also the question of the focus of the corrective feedback, by which I mean, is the corrective feedback directed at just a single type of error, or is it directed at a great range of different types of errors? There's also the possibility of electronic feedback, and there are one or two programs currently available that provide electronic feedback on students' written work. And finally, there's a somewhat different technique which includes corrective feedback but is somewhat broader, called reformulation. So I'm going to talk about each of these strategies and examine some of the research. First of all, direct corrective feedback. This is probably the type of corrective feedback that you are most used to, either as students or as teachers. In this type of feedback, the teacher simply provides the student with the correct form. So typically the teacher might underline an error and then write the correction over the error. There are different ways in which direct corrective feedback can be done, however. And FLERI in fact is the researcher who has perhaps done most work on written corrective feedback. FLERI notes this can take a number of different forms. For example, crossing out an unnecessary word, phrase or morpheme, inserting a missing word or morpheme, and writing the correct form above or near to the erroneous form. Here is an example. The actual texts all come from Japanese college students who were involved in a little project in written corrective feedback that I was conducting in Japan together with a couple of Japanese researchers. And the particular type of writing that we required these college students to do was narrative writing. They were producing a story based on pictures. So you can see here what this particular student wrote. The dog stole bone from butcher. He escaped with having bone. When the dog was going through bridge over river, he found dog in the river, etc. And you can see that in this particular example, all the article errors have been corrected. So it shouldn't be the dog, it should be a dog because it's first mentioned. It should be a bone, it should be a butcher. He escaped with having the bone because the bone is now mentioned. When the dog was going through bridge over a river because the river hasn't yet been mentioned. He found a dog in the river because it's a different dog, not the same dog as previously mentioned. So you can see here an example of direct correction. Now, what are the advantages and disadvantages of this type of corrective feedback? Well, one clear advantage is that it provides learners with explicit guidance about how to correct their errors. That is to say, the error is not only indicated, you are told what the actual correct form is. And Ferris and Roberts suggest that direct corrective feedback is probably better than indirect corrective feedback with students of low levels of proficiency. Can you see why that might be? If the learner is of low level of proficiency, simply indicating the error is not going to be sufficient because the learner will not be able to work out what is correct. So with learners of low level proficiency, probably direct corrective feedback is preferable. But there is a disadvantage. Direct corrective feedback requires minimal processing on the part of the learner. Minimal processing. All the learner has to do is to look to see what the correction is. The learner doesn't have to think about why he made the error, she made the error. All that the learner needs to do is to simply notice the correction, which is minimal processing. And thus, although it might help them to produce the correct form when they revise their writing, it may not contribute to long-term learning. If long-term learning requires deeper processing, then simply noting someone else's correction may not help you to avoid that particular error in the future. However, a recent study by Sheen, and you'll be happy to know that Sheen is a Korean, although working in the United States. A recent study by Sheen, which was published in TESOL Quarterly, suggests that direct corrective feedback can be effective in promoting acquisition of specific grammatical features. She was looking at what I would call low intermediate level learners, and she gave direct corrective feedback, which included providing them with the actual correction, and she showed it did have an effect on their ability to avoid article errors in future new pieces of writing. Let's turn now to the next type of corrective feedback, which is indirect corrective feedback. Indirect corrective feedback involves indicating that the student has made an error, but without actually correcting it. So in other words, you simply indicate that there is an error. This can be done by underlining the errors or using cursors to show omissions in the student's text, or by placing a cross in the margin next to the line containing the error. There's a slight difference there, because if you underline the exact error, learners can see where the error is. If you just put a cross in the margin, they have to actually locate where the error is. So putting a cross in the margin requires more processing than simply underlying the error on the part of the student. In effect, this involves deciding whether or not to show the precise location of the error. So a choice that you have with this particular type of correction is whether to show the precise location of the error or just to indicate that in a line of writing somewhere there is an error. Here is an example of indirect CF. Okay? The way I have done this is to use two symbols. I've used a red cross to show that there is a missing word, and I have used blue crosses to show that there is a wrong word, that the word between the crosses is the wrong word. So for example, the word having, with having bone, the word having is an error, and also going through bridge. I think this is rather charming. It would be nice to see people go through bridges, but you don't go through bridges, you go over bridges, yeah. So there is an example of indirect corrective feedback. Do you like this? Would you like to have your work corrected like this? Or would you like to have direct corrective feedback? What would you prefer? Direct. Yeah, I expected you to say direct. That's because you're lazy and don't want to do so much processing, look, you see? Advantages and disadvantages of indirect corrective feedback. Advantages: caters to guided learning and problem solving and encourages learners to reflect about the linguistic forms, because it makes them think, well, what is the error here? I've got to work it out. Considered more likely to lead to long-term learning. But there are disadvantages. Learners cannot correct if they do not know the correct form, and that's probably why you prefer direct correction, because then you can be certain what the correct form is. And learners may be able to correct, but will not be certain that they have made the correct correction. They won't know for certain. Now, there has been research that has investigated direct versus indirect written corrective feedback. And the results of studies that have investigated this are, in fact, very mixed and inconclusive. And no study has actually compared the effects of these two types of corrective feedback on new pieces of writing. Now, the new pieces of writing is really the crucial measure. Yes, direct and indirect corrective feedback may lead to revision, to correct revision, to improved second draft. But does it enable you to avoid the errors in a new piece of writing? Does it actually contribute to acquisition? The measure of acquisition is the new pieces of writing. We turn now to the third type of corrective feedback, which is metalinguistic corrective feedback. This involves providing learners with some form of explicit metalinguistic comment about the nature of the errors that they have made. And there are two ways in which you can do this. One very common way that is often recommended in teaching methodology handbooks is to use error codes. Error codes are abbreviated labels for different kinds of errors that are placed over the location of the error in the text or perhaps in the margin in the line where there is an error. And I'm going to give you an example so you can see what that looks like in a moment. An alternative is to actually provide a metalinguistic explanation of the learner's errors. And one way that this can be done is by numbering the errors in the text and then at the bottom providing the metalinguistic explanation to show the learner what is wrong with their error. Let's look at some examples. First of all, here is some examples of an error code. I've done this in two ways. In way one, I put the error codes in the margin, in the line where there is an error, and in the other example beneath, I've actually put the error codes immediately above where there is an error. So you can see that in the first line, a dog stole bone from butcher, he escaped with having bone, that there are 3 article errors and there is a wrong word. So WW stands for wrong word. So they then have to go and find where these article errors are and correct them. The second line, when the dog was going through bridge, there is a preposition error and there is an article error. And then finally, river, he found dog in the river, there is another article error. So you can see the codes go in the margin. So this is a little bit more than indirect feedback, because this is not just indicating that there's an error, it's actually giving the learner information about what type of error is involved. Underneath you can see I've done the same thing, but this time I have written the symbols over the actual text where the error occurred. Here is an example of metalinguistic comment. And this was one of the techniques that Sheen used in her study, in effect. So we've got the same text, and we've got numbers to show the errors, and then underneath you've got a metalinguistic explanation. So 1, 2, 5, and 6, the explanation is you need "er" before the noun when a person or thing is mentioned for the first time. And then 3, 7, you need "the" before the noun when the person or thing has been mentioned previously. And 4, you need "over" when you go across the surface of something. You use, there's a typing error there, not "though," "through." You use "through" when you go inside something. You go through the forest. So you can see this provides learners with metalinguistic information. Do you like this? You learners, would you like to have your work corrected like this? You're not sure? Yes? Let's have a show of hands. Learners, how would you like to have your work corrected like this? All right, who would not like to have their work corrected like this? Okay. There must be some teachers in here. Are there teachers in here? Right. Teachers, would you like to do the correction like this? No! So very interestingly, we find that a lot of students would quite like this type of correction, but teachers are not too keen on doing it. Now I wonder why. Maybe it's got something to do with hard work. What about the research on error codes, the use of error codes? Quite a bit. Lalonde, 1982, investigated a group of learners of L2 German that received correction using error codes and showed that they improved in accuracy in subsequent writing, whereas a group receiving direct correction, in fact, made more errors. However, although there was a numerical difference, this numerical difference was not statistically significant. So the actual conclusion of this study was, doesn't make much difference whether in fact you use direct correction or you use some form of error codes. Robb et al. 1986, the use of error codes was found to be no more effective than 3 other types of corrective feedback they investigated. They investigated direct feedback and 2 kinds of indirect feedback. So the use of error codes was no more effective. FLERI, 2006, she found that error codes help students to improve their accuracy over time, but only in 2 of the 4 categories of error that she investigated. These 2 categories were total errors and verb errors. But she found that using error codes did not help learners with noun errors, article errors, or lexical errors, or sentence level errors, word order, for example. So mixed findings again. And Ferris and Roberts, 2001, found that error codes help students to self-edit their writing, but again, no more so than indirect feedback on this particular occasion. So it would seem that overall then, there's very limited evidence to show that error codes help writers to achieve greater accuracy over time. And it would also seem that they are no more effective than other types of corrective feedback in assisting revising, in assisting self-editing. So there's no clear evidence that these error codes really work to date. Yeah? Which is interesting, because as I say, if you go and look at books on how to teach writing, there's a strong possibility that they will suggest that you use error codes. But when you go and look at the research, there's no clear evidence that the error codes work any better than direct or indirect corrective feedback. What about research on metalinguistic comments? This is what you liked, do you remember? Yeah? This is less common than error codes. Now I wonder why. I wonder why it's less common. Maybe it's got something to do with the fact that teachers don't like it. It's time consuming and calls for the teacher to be able to write clear and accurate explanations for a variety of errors. So it's demanding of teachers' ability. They have to have good, explicit knowledge of grammar so that they can provide clear, simple explanations of the errors. Not easy. Sheen, the same Sheen as before, compared direct and metalinguistic corrective feedback, and she found that both were effective in increasing accuracy in students' use of articles in subsequent writing that was completed immediately after the corrective feedback treatment. But, and this is interesting, metalinguistic corrective feedback proved more effective than direct corrective feedback in the long term. This was a typical study, experimental study, where there was a pre-test, there was treatment that involved providing corrective feedback in different forms to different experimental groups. There was an immediate post-test, which was a new piece of writing, and then there was a delayed post-test 2 to 3 weeks later, which was another new piece of writing. So what this study showed was that in the immediate post-test, no difference between the metalinguistic comments and the direct feedback. But 2 weeks later, the metalinguistic feedback was better. One possibility is that the metalinguistic feedback forces learners to formulate some kind of rule about the particular grammatical feature, and then they use this rule. But it takes time for that rule to enable them. It takes time for them to be able to use this rule effectively. And also, direct corrective feedback might have an immediate effect, but you soon forget the correction. Whereas if you've actually learned the rule, maybe it's going to have a longer-term effect on your ability to avoid the errors. So, learners, maybe you were right. Metalinguistic feedback might be a good type of feedback to help you avoid the errors. And teachers, maybe you need to think about how you can do this in an efficient way. Let me talk now a little bit about focused versus unfocused corrective feedback. I mentioned this in my introduction. Focused corrective feedback is where you correct just one type of error, and unfocused corrective feedback is where you correct all or most of the errors. Now, typically, when teachers correct your written work, they tend to correct all the errors you make, or a large number of errors that you make. But one question that I think teachers should ask themselves is that an effective way to do corrective feedback? Or would it be better to focus on one particular error and correct the mistakes only in that error? And then, of course, in the next piece of writing, move on to correcting a different error, and so on. Should you make your corrective feedback focused, or should you make it unfocused? And this distinction between focused and unfocused, of course, applies to all of the previous options that we have looked at. So if you take direct feedback, it can be direct focused or direct unfocused. If you do metalinguistic feedback, it can be metalinguistic focused or metalinguistic unfocused. Advantages and disadvantages. Focused corrective feedback provides multiple corrections of the same error, and thus perhaps is more likely to be attended to by the learners, and perhaps also is more likely to help learners to develop an understanding of the nature of the error. Unfocused corrective feedback addresses a range of errors, so while it might not be as effective in assisting learners to acquire a specific feature as focused corrective feedback in the short term, it may prove superior in the long term. Again, we don't have studies that have compared focused and unfocused corrective feedback. This is an area of work that we need more research in order to be able to say whether in fact focused or unfocused is more effective. The bulk of the corrective feedback studies completed to date have in fact investigated unfocused corrective feedback. The exception is again Sheen's study. She looked at focused corrective feedback, focusing on errors in the use of articles for first and second mention. And she found, as we've already seen, that this proved effective in promoting more accurate language use of this feature. But to date, as I have already said, there have been no studies that have compared the relative effects of focused and unfocused. Electronic corrective feedback. Well, we live in an electronic age, and if we can devise some way of providing electric feedback electronically through the web, through the computer, then I think this is going to be very attractive to teachers and perhaps also to learners. Extensive corpora of written English can be exploited to provide students with assistance in their writing. So you can get, there are many corpora of native speaker written writing, and this can be used and exploited to help learners correct their own writing. Electronic resources provide learners with the means where they can appropriate the usage of more experienced writers. In other words, they can compare how they do something with how experienced native speaker writers do something. And through making the comparison, they can identify their problems, their errors, etc. Here is an example of an electronic corrective feedback system. It's called Mark My Words, and it's a chapter in the book by Hyland and Hyland that I quoted from right at the beginning of my talk, where he explains this particular electronic system. It consists of an electronic store of approximately 100 recurrent lexicogrammatical and style errors that he found occurred frequently in the writing of Chinese students. Milton worked in Hong Kong. A brief comment on each error and with links to resources showing the correct form. So there's an electronic list of errors together with an example of the error, together with a brief comment, metalinguistic comment about the error. The teacher uses the electronic store to insert brief metalinguistic comments in the student's text. So the student have to submit their text electronically, and the student then uses the index of metalinguistic comments to locate an appropriate comment and inserts that comment into the electronic text of the student. The student consults the electronic resources to compare his or her usage with that illustrated in the samples of language made earlier. And this assists the students to self-correct. So when the student gets their text back, they can also go and access corpora in order to identify correct examples of that particular grammatical structure, so they can compare what they have done with the corpora examples. An error log for each piece of writing, drawing students' attention to recurrent linguistic problems, is generated. So the other advantage of this system is it shows that if a student carries on making the error, this is shown to them. There's an error log. They are told that they are continuing to make errors in this particular grammatical structure. So I think that this is quite a promising way, but again, no research to investigate whether this is effective, no research to investigate whether it has any actual effect on acquisition as measured in new pieces of writing. Advantages of electronic corrective feedback: it removes the need for the teacher to be the arbiter of what constitutes the correct form. Typically, if the teacher's marking a student's written text, the teacher has to decide whether something is an error or is not an error. Now, that's not always easy. You might think it's easy for native speakers to do that, but in fact, teachers sometimes invent errors in their students' work. Whereas if you can actually compare what the student has written with native speaker versions, with a native speaker version, then you're able to see whether what the student does actually matches usage. Not just what the teacher thinks is correct, but usage. So this is a usage-based approach to corrective feedback. Teachers' intuitions about grammatical correctness are fallible. Even native speakers are fallible. And I guess non-native speakers are even more worried about the fallibility of their judgments when they are marking students' written work. And arguably, a usage-based approach is more reliable. It allows the learners to locate the corrections that are most appropriate for their own textual intentions. The other thing is that when teachers mark students' written work, they're having to interpret the student's intention. And they may interpret that intention incorrectly. But if the onus of doing the correction is placed on the student, with the electronic resource to help them, then the student can correct in relation to their own particular intention. Finally, we come to reformulation. Reformulation is a technique that has been, for teaching writing, that has been around for some time. You can see here there's a reference to Andrew Cohen, 1989. He says this involves a native speaker rewriting the student's text in such a way as to preserve as many of the writer's ideas as possible while expressing them in his her own words, so as to make the piece sound native-like. So what happens here is that the student writes a text, and this text is then given to a native speaker who rewrites it. Not just corrects the error, but rewrites it, puts it into a native speaker version. The student then gets the native speaker version back and compares what he or she wrote with the native speaker version and produces a revised version of his or her own text. Now, this doesn't mean that you just necessarily go along exactly with what the native speaker said. You don't, because maybe the native speaker has misinterpreted what you meant to say. And what the research tends to show is that the student accepts some of the native speaker's revisions, but not all, etc. So this is correction in the form of reformulating the whole text that the student has produced. So the writer then revises by deciding which of the native speaker's reconstructions to accept. In essence then, reformulation involves two options. It involves direct correction plus revision. but it differs from how these options are typically executed in that the whole of the student's text is reformulated, thus laying the burden on the learner to identify the specific changes that have been made. Here's an example of reformulation compared with error correction. So original version, as he was jogging, his tummy was shaped. Sounds quite exotic, doesn't it? Reformulation, as he was jogging, his tummy was shaking. Error correction, as he was jogging, his tummy underlined. The correct version, tummy written, was shaped, underlined. You can see the difference between the reformulation and the error correction. There is a study, a very recent one, an interesting one, that has compared reformulation and correction, direct correction. In this study, the students were shown their reformulated, corrected stories and asked to study them for 20 minutes and take notes if they wanted. And then one day later, they were given a clean sheet of paper and asked to revise their stories, but they did not have access to either the reformulated corrective text or the notes that they had taken. Both the reformulation and the direct correction groups outperformed the control group. However, the correction group produced more accurate revisions than the reformulation group. So, the direct correction seemed to result in a better second version of the text than the reformulation. It should be noted, however, that reformulation serves also to draw students' attention to higher order stylistic and organizational errors. Reformulation does more than just focus on grammatical errors. It focuses on other aspects of writing as well. So maybe it's not so good for helping students deal with their grammatical errors, but overall it may still prove to be a more effective technique. We come now to the second dimension of conducting written corrective feedback, which is addressing how we want the students to respond to the feedback. The first possibility is revision required. The second possibility is no revisions required. And here there are two possibilities. Students are asked to study corrections, or students are just simply given back their corrected text. Now, my experience as a student, and this goes back a few years now, but my experience as a student is that when my written compositions were corrected and handed back to me, that's all that happened. I did it, the teacher did the corrections, he handed it back to me, I looked at the bottom to see what the grade was and went to my next lesson. Okay? So, the other possibility is doing something that asks the students to actually study the corrections. There's a study that has actually investigated this, another very interesting study by FLERI. She identified a number of revision categories in the redrafts of 146 ESL students' essays. Out of the corrected essays, 80.4% were eliminated in the redrafted compositions, either by correcting the error or by deleting the text containing the error, or by making a correct substitution. 9.9% of the errors were incorrectly revised, and in 9.9% no change was made. So overall research certainly shows that corrective feedback assists revision. These are her categories. She classified the different corrections that she made using the categories listed in the label column in this chart. So we've got error corrected, incorrect change, no change. Sorry, these are the revisions that the students made. So this is a typology of the different revisions that the students made. So you've got error corrected, you've got incorrect change, no change, deleted text, substitution correct, substitution incorrect, teacher-induced error. Look at that one. All right? Teacher-induced error. And averted erroneous teacher marking. Student corrected error despite incomplete or erroneous teacher marking. Sometimes students are better than teachers. There is an important theoretical issue. theories of language learner differ in the importance that they attach to noticing the feedback in input and revising the correct linguistic forms in output. I don't know how familiar you are with second language acquisition theory, but one of the debates that goes on in second language acquisition theory is what is the relative contribution of input to acquisition as opposed to output, production, to language acquisition. And clearly this is the issue here. Because if you require students to do revisions, you are requiring output, production from the learner. If on the other hand, you simply give the corrected text back to the learner and you ask the learner to study their errors, then the focus is entirely on input and noticing the correct error. So this is an interesting area. We might want to do more research that would investigate the relative effects of having students just pay attention to their corrected errors in a written text as opposed to producing a revised version of the text. In the long run, which helps acquisition best? We don't know. No research has investigated this issue. Chandler's study, another interesting written corrective feedback study, this compared indirect corrective feedback plus the opportunity to revise with indirect corrective feedback with no opportunity to revise. So in one case they got corrective feedback, which was indirect, but didn't revise. In the other they revised. Results. Accuracy improved from the first to the fifth piece of writing significantly more in the group that was required to correct their errors, do revisions, than in the group that just received an indication of their errors. This increase in accuracy was not accompanied by any decrease in fluency. So this increase in accuracy was not accompanied by an attempt by the students to write less. Because one way that students can actually avoid making errors is to write less. The less you write, the fewer errors you make, right? So you've got to be very careful in these written corrective feedback studies, because one possibility is that the effects of correcting errors will make students write less, so they make fewer errors. So the good studies also investigate fluency, by which they mean the amount of writing that students produce in the time available. Okay? However, this study cannot be used to claim that corrective feedback revision contributes to L2 learning because there was no control group. I haven't gone into this, but a great weakness of the studies that have invested written corrective feedback is that the studies have had no control group. And this makes it very difficult to say whether the written corrective feedback is actually having any effect on learning. Conclusion. I've gone through my typology, pointing out the strategies for doing corrective feedback and also the options that are available for how students should respond to the corrective feedback. How do we use the typology? The first thing that I want to emphasize is that corrective feedback is a situated phenomenon. Highland and Highland comment, it may be that what is effective feedback for one student in one setting is less so in another. And also, those of you who are familiar with social cultural theory would recognize that a social cultural perspective on corrective feedback emphasizes the need to adjust the type of feedback offered to learners to suit their stage of development. So there may not be just one right way to do corrective feedback. It may well depend on the learner's stage of development, the particular situation that you're in, the student's attitudes, etc. All of this are going to influence which type of corrective feedback is effective. How can teachers use this particular typology that I presented to you? Well, it seems to me that teachers do need to give thought to consider the various options, and I think also teachers need to formulate a very explicit policy for correcting errors in students' written work. Teachers sometimes just get taken over by habit, and maybe this is an area where they need to look at their habit, how they do corrective feedback, and ask themselves, what are the options, what are the alternatives, and maybe to start experimenting with some of the alternatives. So they need to subject their policy to evaluation. by evaluating the effects of their error correction, perhaps by some kind of action research. And it's quite easy to do action research in the case of written corrective feedback. This typology, I think, is also useful for researchers. There's an obvious need for carefully designed studies to further investigate the effects of written corrective feedback in general, and also the effects of different types of corrective feedback. Gwinnett observed that it is important that studies are conducted in a way that makes them comparable, but sadly, this has typically not been the case. And one reason it's not been the case is because there hasn't been a formulated and explicit typology of different corrective feedback types. So I'm hoping that by formulating this typology of corrective feedback types, it will provide a basis for doing systematic research to actually investigate which type is most effective. So my idea is that this typology can serve as a basis for research. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Considering the revision that you mentioned with the direct correction,
Right.
has anyone done more than a single revision? In other words, you correct a paper, give it back, have your student revise it.
I cannot recall any study that's done that. I mean, you're introducing what I think is an interesting idea, and that is that what one might do is correct a student's first draft, maybe using direct correction or indirect correction, right? Just indicating the error, then letting them do a revision of that, then maybe collecting in that draft, this time doing direct correction, giving them back and making them do a second revision. Exactly. I think, well, do the study. You've now got yourself a nice study. You need 3 groups. You need one group that gets no revision, one group that gets 1 revision, and one group that gets 2 revisions. Let's see. All right? Please send it to me when you've done it.
And then a second thing, with the electronic corrective feedback, how much time does that take for a student to do that?
Oh, well, I haven't seen this particular program in action. I've read about it, okay? And I gave you the reference. If you go and look up the Highland and Highland book and you look up Milton's paper, you can read about it. I don't know. I think quite quick, because it's all done by clicking on a ready-made file so that they can quickly locate the particular error that they have made and information about it, etc. All right? The teacher can locate the information quickly and insert it quickly, and then the student can use the link to the corpus to find examples. There's probably got to be a fair bit of training to train students to use it, my guess is. Okay? Maybe read the article, try and get Milton's email, and email it, and find out.
I'm wondering, in the coded feedback, when the students go to read about the certain mistakes that they have made, was that explained bilingually in terms of, I mean, what I mean is in English and in their own language, or just in English?
Are you talking about the metalinguistic feedback, or the error codes?
Error codes?
Well, the error codes are simply abbreviations for different types of errors, like ART for article, or WW for wrong word, or PREP for preposition. All right? So they would typically have a list of the codes, together with some sort of example or explanation as to what the code was, right? So that they could refer to that list if they had forgotten what the abbreviation stood for.
Okay, so maybe I'm talking about metalinguistic.
I think you're talking about metalinguistic, yeah. So do they do it in L1 or do they do it in L2?
Or both.
Well, the only study that I know this has been done in is Sheen's study. And she was looking at ESL students in New Jersey, in the States. And of course, ESL classes are multilingual. They're very mixed. So she used English and provided very simple explanations in English.
The reason I'm asking that is many of the grammar concepts are difficult to understand for the beginner students. And so unless it is done in their own language, many times the students are not able to grasp it in English, unless it is done in English.
Well, I think here we go back to a point I made right at the end, which is, you know, we've really got to view written corrective feedback as situated and variable, yeah? And I'm not sure that with beginner level learners, I would want to use that type of metalinguistic corrective feedback.
Or perhaps even intermediate also. I noticed.
Well, I see no reason, I mean, okay, I see no reason why you don't do it in their L1. Because the purpose is to simply make them aware of the rule. So if you could do this best in their first language, then why not? Okay, so yeah, you could do it. But I'm not so sure that metalinguistic feedback is a good idea for beginner level learners. I mean, to be absolutely honest, with beginner level learners, I don't think we should worry too much about their errors. Because they're going to make lots of errors. So why worry about them, you know? The time to start worrying about errors is when learners move into the intermediate level stage. That's my own view.
So, when a lot of these studies, didn't really show the effectiveness of metalinguistic correction?
Well, there's only one study that's investigated metalinguistic comments, which is Sheen's study, and she found it to be effective. But her correction was highly focused. He was looking at just article errors to refer to first and second mention, and she found that it was effective. In fact, she found it was more effective than direct corrective feedback in the long term. But that's one study, looking at one type of error. So can we generalize? Probably not.
I also have a question about the metalinguistic corrective feedback, especially in terms of coding the errors. I have done sort of relay research on error coding for ESL essays, and I found out that for the same word or for the same phrase, sometimes there are multiple errors. For instance, there's word choice errors, sometimes singularity and plurality errors, and also at the same time article errors.
Right.
And also sometimes local errors and then global errors. And when there are multiple errors for the same problem, the overlapping area in two errors, and what is the best way to provide feedback in that case?
Yeah, good question. I think this is related to my distinction between focused and unfocused corrective feedback in a way, right? And my feeling is that if written corrective feedback is to have some kind of effect on acquisition, not just revision, but acquisition, if that's the purpose, then you're better off doing focused corrective feedback. Now, if you're better off doing focused corrective feedback, that solves your problem, because you may have a phrase or word that contains a multiple error, but you will only correct the error that you're focusing on. You will ignore the others. So that will then address that issue. So your point only really becomes a problem in unfocused corrective feedback. And I tend to think that everything I know about second language acquisition would suggest to me that if you're correcting numerous different types of errors just once or twice in a composition, it's not going to have much effect on learners' acquisition. Whereas if you're correcting the same error and focusing just on that, it may have an effect on learners' acquisition.
I think your lecture was very informative.
Very, very, very enjoyable or informative? Informative, only informative, okay.
But the typology for corrective feedback is very useful, I think. I thought, the thoughts that come into my mind is that it's too much for teachers because there is no absolute answer. But I think that is the reality. But there are many factors involved in the process of corrective feedback.
Yes.
For example, more detail for low motivated students, more detailed corrective feedback will distract their attention and move for more motivated, highly motivated students. More detailed corrective feedback will be informative.
Right.
Yes, and also you mentioned the sociolinguistic factors.
Yeah, I mean, I think you were saying what I was trying to make the point at the end again about the fact that corrective feedback is situated.
Yes.
And we shouldn't necessarily perhaps be thinking about what is the best way to do, is there one best way to do corrective feedback? We should perhaps not be thinking about that way. We should be thinking about who are our students? What is the best type of corrective feedback for our particular students? And constructing an explicit policy for doing corrective feedback for the particular students we're teaching. And if we're teaching another very different class of students, maybe we need a different policy for doing written corrective feedback.
Yes, that means there should be.
Are you highly motivated?
Of course.
Of course. So you'd like to have all your errors corrected, would you?
No,
What would you like then?
I don't know.
You don't know. Well, you must, when you leave here, you must go away and think about it. All right? And work out I mean, this is another thing that I also think ought to happen, and that is there ought to be more discussion between teachers and students about how written corrective feedback is actually done. Now, but by the way, this doesn't necessarily mean that teachers should do what their students want them to do, because students are often wrong, right? Students, for example, if asked, might say, oh, I want all my errors corrected. But I am not personally convinced that that is necessarily the best way to do written corrective feedback, that a more focused approach is better. But then the teacher could perhaps explain to the students why they were adopting a focused approach to written corrective feedback, and the fact that they will be switching from focusing on one error to another error in different pieces of writing, etc. But I would like to see some kind of negotiation and discussion take place between teachers and students with regard to this issue. I mean, the other thing that is quite crucial is that teachers need to take very seriously what students do when they get their written work back that's been corrected. Simply handing it back to them and saying, that's it, I've done my job, right, is not probably the best way. There's got to be, I mean, you know, in the study that I referred to in Japan, what we did was there was no revision, but we gave them their written text back, and we gave them in class 5 to 10 minutes to look at their corrections and think about their corrections. So they were forced in class to spend time looking at their written corrections, etc. In general, the research on written corrective feedback is very limited. Have any of you come across the name of Truscott? Yeah, now Truscott has written a number of reviews of the work that's investigated written corrective feedback and basically said it's useless. And the reason he says it's useless is he says that first of all, many of the studies don't distinguish between the effects on revision and the effects on new pieces of writing. And secondly, the studies have not included control groups, so we have no idea whether learners would just improve by doing the writing alone to get the correction, okay? So he says there's absolutely no evidence, and he says in fact there's lots of theoretical evidence to suggest that written corrective feedback is not going to help students' acquisition at all, and cites people like Krashen, for example, who is not very keen on written corrective feedback. So, you know, I mean, this is a messy area. But there are one or two studies that are now beginning to appear, like Sheen's study, and I have a study coming out with my co-researchers in Japan to be published in System later this year, that does show that focused corrective feedback can have an effect on new pieces of writing. Okay? But it's a messy area from a research point of view. I mean, this is an interesting issue because we've got so much of it written from a pedagogic point of view, and yet very unsatisfactory, messy area from the point of view of research. And you might ask, why have these studies got no control groups? Well, the reason given by writing researchers is that it's not ethical not to correct your students' work. And you can't do unethical research. So that's why they don't have control groups, etc. But there are studies that are now beginning to appear that do have control groups in. I think that's a dubious argument myself. Yeah? Because if Truscott is right, and simply doing the practice in writing will help you gradually improve, yeah, then it's perfectly ethical not to do the correction. So, so the studies are beginning to appear now. Truscott's wrong, in my view. Error correction does assist acquisition. That is my own view, all right? But what we don't really know is under what conditions, with what types of learners, when, with what grammatical structures. Those are the sorts of questions we don't know.
Thank you for your enjoyable presentation. I was just thinking throughout your presentation that if I know that you wanted to focus just on the the kind of the grammatical errors and the accuracy part, as you said at the beginning of your presentation, but what I was concerned with was that if people in Korea misinterpret your presentation, you're kind of adding flame to the fire of a kind of education system that's heavily based on accuracy. And it's kind of like, which I think in the Korean education system, the emphasis on accuracy is what prevents a lot of the fluency. And so I was wondering if you view, the actual levels of the writing, let's say middle school and high school, are not very good. So I was wondering what your idea on low-level error corrections are.
Well, I already said that, I said earlier actually, that in my view, with low-level learners, with low-level writers, we shouldn't worry too much about accuracy. I said earlier that to my mind, written corrective feedback becomes much more important when learners reach the intermediate level of learning, of intermediate level of English. And I do believe that. So to a certain extent, I've already said what you say. I will add one other thing, and that is that obviously when we ask students to do a piece of writing, we are potentially doing two things, two separate things, but related. One is to give them practice in developing writing skills, right? And the second is to give them a task that will help them to acquire English, okay? Now, I guess that I have been particularly interested in using writing as a device, a mechanism, for helping students to acquire English. Now, if you're familiar with some of the kinds of arguments that go on these days, you probably have heard the term focus on form. Now, the term focus on form refers to the idea that you give learners some kind of meaning-based activity, but in the context of that meaning-based activity, you direct their attention to form. So their attention is directed to form when they have a problem with it, right? Now, one of the reasons I'm interested in written corrective feedback is because it can be viewed as a type of focus on form. The work on focus on form is typically dealt with oral corrective feedback, and I've done that as well. But it seems to me that it also applies to written corrective feedback. So, learners are asked to write a text, they're asked to express meaning, to tell a story, to write a report, whatever. So the focus is primarily on meaning. Problems arise, you address those linguistic problems in the context of their efforts to mean, and hopefully that is going to assist the process of language acquisition. So that's where I'm coming at. But I do admit equally that if you're doing written corrective feedback from the point of view of improving students' writing skills, then you're probably going to want to focus on organization, discourse level skills, etc. Right? So I do think it's useful for teachers to kind of separate out in their mind these two purposes for getting students to do writing. One is to improve their writing skills, the other is as a mechanism, a device, for helping them to acquire English. Does that answer?
Yes, and I appreciate your answer. It's just that my concern was that, you know, like there's a lot of accuracy, there's a lot of error correction going on as of now, as it is. And, you know, I think it's great to see the topology, but I'm just worried that this is just kind of saying.
Well, next time invite me back sometime, and I'll do a talk on task-based language teaching for you. All right?
Thank you.
And why task-based language teaching is what should be happening in junior and senior high school. Okay? And why you shouldn't even be bothering to teach English in the elementary school. All right?
Okay. Okay, next then we'll invite you.
Yes, hello. I was wondering if you could perhaps address some of the practical aspects from a teacher's point of view, assigning homework assignments, handwritten versus Microsoft Word processed, written homework assignments. Which one would you find more useful for saliency in when you are correcting errors?
Well, I mean, first of all, it depends how, as a teacher, you're going to correct the errors. I mean, if you're going to use an electronic feedback system, such as the one that Milton used, you must get students to present electronic text to you, right? So you've got to use Microsoft Word texts. But if you're going to do more traditional type correction, where you're manually correcting their errors in one way or another, as I've suggested, then it doesn't really matter whether they hand in a electronic version, a word processed version, or a handwritten version. I mean, from a teacher's point of view, it's a little easier to mark a word processed, a typed version, than it is a handwritten version, because I have lots of problems reading students' handwriting.
My point being, if rewrites are given, it would seem that just simply going back to the file and focusing only on that error would not allow the student to fully see the context of the error.
Well,
on the other hand, handwritten rewrites would allow them to fully go through and do the whole thing.
I think it depends on the type of correction. I mean, if you're doing metalinguistic correction or error codes, they still have to locate the error, and they have to process exactly what is involved in doing the correction. So I think there's quite a lot of deep processing involved, whether it was in a handwritten version or a typed version. I don't think it would make any difference. Maybe if you're doing direct correction by giving them the actual correction and typing that in their electronic version, then maybe you're right? There's not much for them to do other than just simply delete the wrong word and put in the right word which you've given them, right? So yes, I would think in that particular case that is true. But the other types of correction, even if they were done on an electronic version, would involve quite deep processing, I think. Take Sheen's idea of the metalinguistic comments at the end. I mean, that involves quite a lot of processing, whether you've done that on a handwritten version, which he did, or an electronic version. I think it depends on the type of correction that you're using.
Why don't you give him another big hand for